learned a long time ago that I have bad taste. I think I first discovered this back in 2015 when I was the only person who not only liked but loved Halo 5 Guardians. But 2017 was the year that this became a core part of my self-understanding. In 2017, I came out of the cinema having just seen a movie called Star Wars Episode 8: The Last Jedi, and I loved it. I thought it was incredible, and I excitedly went online to join in on the unanimous praise I assumed would be there, only to discover an uncomfortable reality. I wasn't that surprised though. After all, I had done the exact same thing a few months ago, when Mass Effect Andromeda came out in March of that very same year. I love Mass Effect Andromeda. I've always loved Mass Effect Andromeda. I love it now. I loved it when it first came out, when it was still a broken jank fest. And I've always felt like the fool for it. It's very strange to look at review aggregators and see a wall of 7 out of 10s, because the reputation surrounding this game has always been atrocious. I mean, it's the game that killed Mass Effect for almost a full decade now, the start of a new series that was dead on arrival. The memes. Oh god, the memes. And I get it. Mass Effect Andromeda is a game with problems. It has more problems than any other game in BioWare's modern catalogue, except maybe Anthem. I never played it. It's a game where making the most of it often means doing the heavy lifting and working around the parts of the game that don't quite work and using your imagination to fill in the blanks. And by blanks, I of course mean blank facial expressions. As with Mass Effect 3, it's my preference not to play defense. I want to talk about Andromeda as the game that it is, or at least the game that it is now after a few patches, and not the catastrophe that it was. Because despite it all, I do think it's a great game. There's a lot of caveats on that statement, but a great game nonetheless, one worthy of the name. We've talked about flawed endings, so now let's talk about flawed beginnings.
Every great moment in our history began with a dream. Each bold leap forward was achieved by those willing to do anything to attain it.
One of the most fascinating things about Andromeda is how perfectly the game works as a metaphor for itself. The Andromeda Initiative was a bold dream. 100,000 of the best and brightest each species has to offer, who board massive ships and take a 600-year journey to the Andromeda Galaxy, our nearest neighbour in the vast cosmos. Their goal is not just to explore a new galaxy, but to start a new civilization, one free of the messy politics and bigotry and old resentments of the Milky Way. A society where everyone, regardless of species, works together for the betterment of all. It's an incredibly optimistic plan, and absolutely none of it pans out. Everything that could possibly go wrong for the initiative does. The golden worlds they were supposed to find are uninhabitable. The entire region of space is infested by a strange glowing mass of dark energy called the Scourge. There's a race of extremely hostile aliens, the Kett, who attack on sight, and even more problems on top of all that. It's a mix of problems that the initiative couldn't possibly have accounted for, and some that they very obviously should have. And now all that's left for you to do is pick up the pieces and try to make the most of a bad situation. A few months after release, Jason Schreier released an article for Kotaku interviewing many of the developers to get an inside look at exactly what went wrong during the development of Mass Effect Andromeda. The answer is pretty much everything. The game was massively overscoped for what they could reasonably achieve. They were being forced to use a new engine that they didn't know and wasn't designed for RPGs. There was political turmoil between the BioWare sub-studios about who was working on which project, which resulted in half the animation team being sent to work on Anthem. Many problems, and the results are evident in the final product, even after all the patches. The game had a lot of expectations to live up to. And it didn't. It left a lot of people disappointed and some people unreasonably angry. All that's left to do now is work with what we've got and make the best of a bad situation. Andromeda shares more than a few problems with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a big one being that the start of the game sets expectations that the rest of the game never really lives up to. The opening hour of Andromeda is excellent, easily on par with the storytelling and cinematic polish of the trilogy. It efficiently introduces the world, the stakes, the core gameplay, A ton of mysteries for the rest of the game to build on, as well as taking the time to establish Ryder, the new protagonist, and some of the game's core companions. Ryder is part of the Pathfinder team, the exploratory force of the initiative. Part scientist, part adventurer, part soldier, all problem solver. The team is led by their dad, Alec Ryder, one of the main figureheads of the initiative and a rather stern and stoic former N7. Having a dad is one of the many things that makes Ryder the most pre-established character in any BioWare game to date. Only Hawk in Dragon Age 2 comes close. Ryder has a family, they have a set backstory, they have a much more concrete personality than Shepard, and, depending on your choices in character creation, they even have a full name.
Hello, Sarah.
Andromeda also makes both Ryders, male and female, canon. They're twins. Whichever one you don't pick still exists in the game world and has a fairly significant role in the story. Where Shepard was a step in taking control away from the player, Ryder is a much bigger step, to the point where I've long held my own conspiracy theory that there's a version of this game somewhere in development that doesn't have a character creator at all. Having a first name has a surprisingly big impact on the story. There's a very meta scene back in Mass Effect 3 with Dr. Chakwas, where the game pokes fun at the fact that nobody ever calls Shepard by their first name. And that's because Shepard has no first name. The first name is player determined, mostly as a way to manage different save files. But it's also an annoying joke, because it's true. It's very unnatural that after being friends with these folks for years, and even falling in love with them, they never bother learning your name. In Andromeda, your first name becomes a signifier of your relationships with people. Strangers call you Ryder, but it's Sarah to your friends. This is one of the ways the game wins over me specifically. I vastly prefer this approach to RPG protagonists over the more open-ended approach of traditional RPGs. Sarah and Scott Ryder are characters, they are not player vessels. Ryder is a deliberate contrast to Shepard in many ways. They're younger, they're less experienced, less grizzled, and generally a lot less professional. They have some military experience, but nothing as traumatic or career-defining as any of Shepard's potential backstories. This also blends in with the new approach to dialogue. Paragon and Renegade are out in favour of the tone wheel introduced in Dragon Age 2. This is a positive change because Paragon and Renegade limited choices in the trilogy to a false binary that heavily incentivized one playstyle over another. But it also has some drawbacks for people still looking for an open-ended RPG. Paragon and Renegade did create two very distinct playthroughs of Mass Effect, and Andromeda's tone wheel does not have the same impact. Like its implementation in Dragon Age, the tone wheel only determines tone. It's a tool of conversational flavour, not conversational impact. This is because Ryder is a much more established character. Everything on the wheel will always be something Ryder could realistically say in any given scenario. Will you be empathetic, logical, professional, or casual? There's no incentive to stick to any of these paths, they are all equally valid in whatever you think the situation calls for. You rarely get the option to be an asshole or to work against the narrative structure of the game. There is no evil or dark path in Andromeda. Ryder will always skew more Paragon no matter what you pick because Ryder is always Ryder. Like Mass Effect 3, there is a ton of dialogue spoken outside of player control, and the things you do get control over are generally lower stakes than the choices in the trilogy. Things like, what's your relationship with your dad? Love and respect or quiet resentment? Did you come to Andromeda for the adventure, for the vision, or because you had no other choice? I value choices like this because these are the choices that help you craft your own story. Maybe not in a big way, but in a small way. Lots and lots and lots of small decisions that add up. Andromeda is not as replayable as the trilogy, and yet I've replayed it a bunch anyway for the same reason I keep replaying any number of non-RPG single-player games. I want to hear the story again. Habitat 7, the not-so-golden world that the human ark was supposed to claim as home, does an excellent job of establishing all this. Habitat 7 is strange and alien, with glowy plants and floating rocks and an atmosphere of poison. Your AI assistant, Sam, is offline for most of the mission, meaning there's nothing for Ryder and Liam, your first companion, to do but speculate. The area you crash in is very open with a variety of side paths to explore. You discover evidence of two different alien species. There's the weird bony guys who immediately attack you, but it's clear from their equipment that they're not natives of the planet. Then there's the ancient ruins that they're studying, although a quick scan shows they're about 400 years old, meaning they're technically younger than the Initiative. Andromeda is much more of a sequel to Mass Effect 1 than it is to Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 2 moved away from exploration and discovery as a driving force of gameplay and narrative, in favour of mostly linear, highly cinematic action. The entire game is a series of discoveries, tapping into a different flavour of sci-fi storytelling. Habitat 7 encourages you to go off the beaten path and explore, as both player and player character try to put together exactly what's happening. It also sets the tone. It's a tense and dangerous situation, but Ryder and Liam are both young, cocky, adrenaline junkies. They're as excited about all this as they are worried, and their banter throughout the mission is constant. Critics have really turned on the Marvel style of quippy banter that was becoming inescapable around this time. But I have a high tolerance for cringe, and I still enjoy this style of writing well enough, especially for young adventurous types like Ryder and Liam. The guy who voices Scott Ryder sounds quite a bit like Nolan North, and I think Nathan Drake is absolutely the energy that Ryder channels. Serious and capable when needed, but a bit of a goofball otherwise. It's a stark contrast to your dad, the no-nonsense professional. He has a plan. He's unfazed in the face of danger. He's the guy everyone wants in charge in a time like this. So of course he immediately dies, sacrificing himself to save his kid and naming them his successor in the process. It's about as close to a passing the torch moment as the game can get. Alec is his own man with his own story, but in this moment he is a stand-in for Shepard, the old soldier, passing the mantle to the next generation. It's a feeling that's going round the Initiative as a whole. With Habitat 7 a bust, the next port of call is the Nexus, a Citadel-like space station that was sent out a few months ahead of the ARCs to serve as the central hub of the Initiative. But there's not much help to be found there, only an even bigger pile of problems. The Nexus also hit the Scourge, killing many of the Initiative's leaders, including their founder, Jean Garson. The chain of command then made its way down to a Weasley little Solarian accountant, Jaren Tan, voiced by Kumail Nanjiani. The Nexus are low on resources, construction has completely halted, all of their outposts have failed, and when all of this started to get to people, there was a civil war that ended with a significant chunk of the station's population being exiled. Suffice it to say, you don't receive a warm welcome on arrival. There's a lot of infamous dialogue in this scene, specifically with the head of Colonial Affairs, Foster Addison. So I suppose it's as good a time as any to talk about animation. Conversations in this game look undeniably weird. The character models all have much higher fidelity than the Mass Effect trilogy, but this combines with less expressive animation to veer straight into the uncanny valley. There's also a lot of weird issues with eye lines. They tend to wander in ways that look very strange. It's especially unfortunate for Sarah, whose default expression is a big grin. When you're just walking around, it's a detail that gives her a lot of personality. But when it's in cutscenes that are supposed to be sad or serious and she's still got that big happy grin, it can look very broken. The most infamous scene in the game has now been patched out. When you were first explaining to Addison that your dad is dead, and Sarah delivered this news with a big beaming grin on her face. It's the kind of obvious, hilarious jank that was destined to spawn a million memes. And even with the most infamous moments patched out, the game is still full of them. A little later in the same conversation, Addison says that her face is tired. It's meant metaphorically. She's talking about her friendly face, her customer service face, because she's given up on that and is just being blunt and rude. But on launch, this was coupled with no accompanying facial animations, making it seem literal. She literally can't move her face anymore. This is an understandable problem. RPGs have a lot of dialogue, too much to handcraft it all in a reasonable amount of time, so there are various shortcuts developers use to speed up that process. But those shortcuts mix very badly with the high-fidelity graphics of Andromeda, in a way that the same shortcuts in the trilogy don't stand out nearly as badly. It also didn't help that, as mentioned, half the animation team was yanked off the project to work on Anthem, which the studio was sure was going to be their next big moneymaker. Being an understandable problem doesn't make it any less distracting. Foster Addison is an interesting character on paper and in her vocal performance, but it often gets lost in the lackluster presentation of the game. She's a bureaucrat turned pioneer. She has a lot of big ideas and absolutely no power. because being head of colonial affairs doesn't matter much when there's no colonies. She's bitter, resentful, and more than a little bit shady, but she's ultimately not a bad person. She's just been beaten down by a year of hell. Each of the Nexus leaders are fully fleshed out characters. They bicker constantly, they do not get along with each other, and are all woefully unprepared to lead during a crisis. The most likeable is Kesh, the superintendent of the station and seemingly the only Krogan on board. She's friendly, level-headed and professional in a very non-traditional Krogan sort of way. There's also Kandros, who leads the station militia, who's a fairly typical Turian and not really built for politics. All of them dislike Tan, and with good reason. Tan sucks. He's an ineffectual leader who doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't have the charisma to inspire people, nor the knowledge to lead a new civilization. But he's also the only guy willing to do the job, so they're stuck with him. It's clear that a big part of the reason things have gone so bad on the Nexus is a failure in leadership. They've made bad decisions over the last 14 months, and constantly argue with each other about the best course of action. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Tan gives you a ship and a mission to head to Eos, the site of the first 2 failures to create an outpost, with the very open-ended goal to make the planet hospitable. And that open-ended goal makes up the structure of most of the game. One of the big things that made Andromeda's production such a mess is that the team spent about 3 years chasing a pipe dream. It was decided early on that rather than having handcrafted, curated open worlds, the game would spill out hundreds of planets with procedural generation, very similar to No Man's Sky. What they didn't think about, but obviously should have, is that procedural generation and story-rich role-playing are diametrically opposed designs. This was definitively proven a few years later when Bethesda dropped Starfield, an open-world space RPG that has a bunch of prog-gen planets for you to run around on and do nothing. To quote one of the anonymous developers in Jason Schreier's article, they were creating planets and they were able to drive around in it and the mechanics of it were there. I think what they were struggling with was that it was never fun. They were never able to do it in a way that's compelling, where, like, okay, now imagine doing this 100 more times, or 1,000 more times. Procedural generation seems to fascinate a lot of game developers, and I've never understood why. Being technically impressive doesn't automatically translate to being fun or interesting. It's good that BioWare realised that before it was too late, but they should have realised it a lot sooner. When the decision finally came down, the team had about 1.5 years to turn hundreds of pointless worlds into 7 handcrafted regions. This was obviously the correct decision, and the final game is much better than 100 planets of nothing would have been, but it also has its fair share of problems. Andromeda's open worlds are structurally identical to Dragon Age Inquisition, down to having the exact same problems as Inquisition. I love a big open world, but it's pretty clear that BioWare doesn't really know how to make them. Eos is a good example because it's probably the most finished and polished map in the game, and it's a desert. It's a nice desert, it's scenic, but it's a desert. There's not a plethora of interesting discoveries to make. Most of the side content involves driving a long distance to shoot some guys for a vague and sometimes completely pointless reason, and then driving some more. It's an experience very evocative of the uncharted worlds from Mass Effect 1, but that's not a positive comparison. The driving and the shooting are much better than Mass Effect 1 because those are the only elements of the game that did get the full 5 years of development. Combat in Andromeda is kinetic and snappy. You can still play it like a cover-based shooter if you want, but there's a much bigger focus on movement and momentum. You can jump and dash around to stay mobile instead of crouching behind a crate. There's a massive variety of different weapons, and unlike previous games, you can access all of the skills from any of the classes right from the start, giving you a huge variety to work with and mix things around to find a playstyle that suits you. I'd be hard-pressed to say the combat is better than Mass Effect 3, because they're almost too different to compare. There's pretty much no strategy left in the combat. You don't even get to select your companion's weapons or what abilities they use. They're just fire support for your action-driven experience. But that's not really a loss as much as a pivot. Combat in Andromeda feels great. When you're in a firefight and the scenery hits right and the sound design hits right, Andromeda comes to life. It's all the spaces between where the cracks start to show. The hinterlands was a brick wall in a lot of players' experience with Dragon Age Inquisition. It was a giant area of rolling green hills filled with some of the most tertiary, boring side content ever put into an open world. Stuff like multiple quests to herd farm animals. EOS tries to rein it in, but ultimately builds the exact same wall for players of Andromeda. One of the most infamous quests in the game is from the initiative's chief geologist. He wants you to scan some rocks. These rocks are not placed in obvious places. You have to go out of your way to look for them. 16 rocks found across 6 planets. After scanning all 16 rocks and returning to the geologist, he thanks you for your contribution to science and hands you 200 credits. This is the definition of busy work. It's a thing to do for the sake of a thing to do. It's not fun. They're rocks. They look like rocks, and when you scan them, you learn that they're made of rock. It's not rewarding. It's a thing to do to check an icon off the map. And that's the real problem. Every scannable rock is marked on the map with the same icon as the real side quests, with plot and role-playing and lore implications. There are plenty of genuinely good side quests in Mass Effect Andromeda, and once you've already played the game and know which ones are worth doing and which ones are pointless filler, the game clicks a lot better. But you're probably not psychic, and there's no way to tell which is which. You might argue that scanning rocks is a complete waste of time and shouldn't be in the game at all, and that's a fair comment, but I'm not opposed to busy work as long as it's clearly marked as such. Case in point, Mass Effect 1 also has a bunch of rocks to scan for a mediocre reward. But Mass Effect 1 has a much clearer distinction. It has a different map icon. It's on the Uncharted worlds, which are clearly designated as lesser content than the main story. There's no rocks to scan on Noveria for a reason. A few years ago, in an interview with Eurogamer, eventual game director Mac Walters reflected on the failure of Andromeda like this. If you tried to put all the content of Mass Effect 3 on the Mass Effect 1 team, it would have taken us 10 years. There was just a lot of things we had to relearn, refigure out, and ultimately, when you do that, it's very, very challenging to come out and be as polished as your third iteration was. And we didn't hit that. And we probably should have, in hindsight, just reduced scope more and executed on what we could do to ensure quality. But we were also in a weird phase in the industry where a lot of people were saying quantity was quality. So we were deluding ourselves internally a little bit that if it's maybe not as polished as Mass Effect 3, it's fine. It's bigger and there's more here and there's more to do. And we hit a point where people were like, no, that isn't okay. Andromeda is, by a fair margin, the biggest game in the series, but at least half of that length is only on the mechanical side of the experience. It's checklisting things off the map to make a number go up, a lot of which, like the rocks, have no story content at all. At the same time, this sort of is the main story. This is how you make the planets viable, as Tan asked you to do. Every side activity contributes to the overall viability of the planet. Place some beacons? That's 2% viability. Solve a murder? That's another 2% viability. There's more side activities on each planet than you need to reach 100% viability, but you're going to have to do some of it to get there. The atmosphere on Eos is radioactive, making it extra difficult to establish any kind of settlement. But every planet you see has the same remnant technology scattered around the place. A massive terraforming network, which once activated, makes the planet much more habitable, giving you a nice 40% boost to viability. It's fully possible to reach 100% viability only doing the interesting quests, but I don't think that's how most people's brains work. I think most people see an icon on the map and they feel the need to go there and scan the rock. And if you came looking for a story-driven RPG, that's a very tedious experience. It makes a pretty fatal combination with the inventory situation, which is, impressively, even more tedious than Mass Effect 1. There's a console in the centre of the Tempest with 4 different terminals that all control different systems with their own currencies. It's absurd. A giant pile of admin to do every time you come back to the ship, which is another problem it shares with Dragon Age Inquisition. The selection of weapons is much better than Mass Effect 1, but we're back to the thing where you want to have the one with the biggest number next to it for the bestest damage output. It may offer the potential of some wacky combinations like a shotgun that fires grenades, but like most bolted-on crafting systems, it's pretty boring. So with this many complaints, you might be starting to wonder how exactly I could call this broken, tedious, bloated game great, or even good. But the reason is simple. It's the same reason that Inquisition is my favourite Dragon Age game. Sometimes the substance of a journey just isn't as important as the people along for the ride. Andromeda has 6 companions, and all 6 of them are echoes of one of the 6 companions of Mass Effect 1. I think 6 is the perfect number for a game like this. It's enough to feel like a team, but not too much that anyone gets lost in the shuffle. It's usually the boring humans who end up lost in that shuffle, but Andromeda really tries its best to correct that. Cora Harper and Liam Costa are the echoes of Caden and Ashley, respectively. The cool and collected biotic and the hot-headed soldier. But Andromeda takes so much more time to flesh out each of these characters than Mass Effect 1, with its smaller focus on companions, ever did. Where Ashley was a stand-in for an Alliance regular, Liam has the more interesting role as a stand-in for the typical Initiative volunteer. Like many a colonial fantasy before it, the Initiative sold people a dream. An idyllic new galaxy full of golden worlds and an opportunity to be free, make something of yourself, and build a better future. Everyone in the Initiative has their own reason for coming. Some because they're running from their past, some on a whim, but most people, like Liam, are here because they bought the pitch. He's a dreamer. He believes in a better world and in mutual cooperation and all that other front-of-the-flyer stuff. The reason the game starts with Liam is that Liam encapsulates the game's new tone. Andromeda is much less dark and dramatic than the trilogy. It's the only game in BioWare's modern catalogue where none of your companions can die. Even Veilguard has some fatalities. Liam has no tragic backstory. In fact, in an early conversation he pokes fun at himself for that. He had parents who loved him, he had a good job, he had friends. He would not fit in the extended trauma bonding session that is the crew of the Normandy. That's not to say he's flawless. He has no patience for political bullshit, in fact not much patience at all. And as the dream of the Initiative fails to materialise, he gets more and more frustrated about it. Both Cora and Liam map pretty well to the tone wheel, and it's likely that depending on how you play Ryder, you'll gravitate to one or the other. Cora is professional and logical, sometimes to a fault. And Liam is empathetic and casual, usually to a fault. He's very quippy, he's always upbeat, he charges headlong into danger. He's the kind of guy that if he wasn't doing this, he'd be base jumping off of cliffs in Switzerland. A lot of players really hate Liam. He often tops lists of worst BioWare companions. And I think that's because he's a very particular kind of guy. He's impulsive, reckless, and a danger to himself and the people around him. The kind of guy who's destined to die young, either by doing something stupid or, more likely, saying something stupid. He can be a hard guy to like. Some of the other companions really don't get on with him at all because he has a tendency to open his mouth without thinking and blurt out some seriously irritating or aggravating stuff. He means well, he's noble and genuinely wants to help and make things better, but he's often blind to and annoyed by the grey areas and the long-term consequences of his actions. Liam is a hot mess and a borderline liability to the team, which comes to a head during his loyalty mission, where he manages to get the crew kidnapped by pirates with no backup and essentially wings his way to victory with a tremendous amount of luck. I don't think any of this makes Liam a bad character. I like Liam. I like him because I get him. He wants simple solutions to complicated problems, and I feel that every day. He hides frustration and isolation behind sarcasm and optimism, and I know that tactic well. He has a tendency to come across as obnoxious in his attempts to be helpful, and I know what that's like. And the Initiative is full of Liams, because this kind of person is the exact kind of person who signs up for a one-way trip to another galaxy based on nothing more than hopes and dreams. It's not the sort of thing you do as a long-term planner. Liam has much more in common with Tan than he'd ever like to admit. And it's one of the many reasons the Initiative was doomed to be a train wreck no matter what they encountered on the other side. Because Liam is not the guy who's going to build stable foundations for a new civilization. At least not until he takes his lumps and learns his lesson. Liam does mellow out eventually. He realises that you can't rush a dream. You need to build it slowly, brick by brick. But that doesn't mean he can't channel his energy into something more productive. This is what I truly love about the companions of Andromeda. They are all flawed people. They have rough edges to work out and things that sometimes make them annoying and unlikable. But they grow, they change, and they evolve over the course of the story. They come together to make each other stronger. Cora Harper may be the most flawed of all, even if she'd never show or admit it. Cora is your second in command. She was supposed to be your boss, but dear old dad chose you instead of her, and because of complicated AI reasons, there's no changing it now. She's a little bitter about that, but too professional to hold a grudge. Instead, she turns it into a question. Why not me? Like Caden, Cora is an incredibly gifted biotic, and likewise, back in the Milky Way, this made her a bit of a social outcast. She joined the military because that's just what gifted biotics do. And when they recognised her talent surpassed their ability to teach, they sent her to join a team of Asari commandos as part of a cross-species military program. During this 4-year tour, Cora became a little obsessed with the Asari. She deeply values their culture, their philosophy, and their combat tactics and works to incorporate all of it into her own life, to the point of starting to abandon her own identity in the process. It becomes clear during your conversations with Cora why your dad didn't make her the Pathfinder. It wasn't just nepotism. Cora is smart, talented, and dependable, but she doesn't have the self-confidence necessary to make the hard calls. She doesn't have the self-identity necessary to inspire people. She doesn't have that main character energy. In everything she does, she looks for guidance. Cora's reason for joining the initiative was exactly that. When her tour of duty was done, Cora wanted to stay with the Asari, but her mentor in the Commandos turned her down. She said that the initiative was a better fit for her. Cora is resentful of that, another rejection, another place she doesn't belong, but her mentor saw what Cora couldn't, that she would never be herself if all she ever does is try to be like someone else. She didn't internalize the lesson. Instead, she just found a new mentor in the form of Alec Ryder, started copying some of his mannerisms and internalizing his vision of the future. But now he's dead, and Cora is once again without a mentor. So, as always, she goes looking for a new one. She takes it upon herself to find and rescue the Asari Ark, but what she's really looking for is a famous Asari commando, Sarissa, who wrote most of the strategy textbooks that Cora fawns over. She's looking for a figure of authority who can tell her what to do, because the situation is stuffed and nobody seems to have a plan. The problem with offloading your thinking to someone else is that not every mentor is worth following, and you need to have your own internal beliefs and guidelines to be able to make that distinction. Sarissa is extremely shady. The reason the Asari Ark hasn't made it to the Nexus is that they've been on the run for months. Sarissa stole an important data module from the kit, knowingly allowing her Pathfinder to die in the process, and as a result the Ark is being hunted by a kit war party. Cora is clearly disgusted by her actions, but she doesn't know how to respond to them. She's been hyping this woman up for weeks, only for it to turn out that she kinda sucks and she doesn't like her. It's the bump Cora needs to finally find her own feet, her own drive, and her own certainty. It's also an interesting example of how choice is handled in Andromeda. You get to decide what to do with Sarissa. You can suppress what she did and let her stay as the Pathfinder, rationalizing her actions as necessary, or you can expose her and let her second, a young, unconfident rookie, take her place instead. There's not a right or wrong answer, but there is a more satisfying answer. If you expose Sarissa, then Cora takes the new Pathfinder under her wing and begins to mentor her. She stops looking for a mentor and becomes one. It brings her story full circle and completes Cora's transformation into herself. Confident, self-assured, and ready to lead. If you keep Sarissa in charge, then it's more of a never meet your heroes story, which is still a valid outcome and it leads Cora to the same emotional place, but it's a story that leans towards cynicism, where Andromeda feels like a game about optimism. This is not a world-shaking choice, but RPGs are not just sandboxes for smashing toys together to see different outcomes. A good RPG is about being the co-author of a story. Maybe you want a story with more cynicism, and that's okay too. This kind of choice is why Paragon and Renegade had to go. Paragon and Renegade was also a choice between optimism and cynicism, but it made the line between them too obvious, colour-coded. In Andromeda, it's all shades of grey. Cora's story is not one with high drama and big stakes. It's a story of self-determination. It's a story about figuring out who you are and where you belong, and ultimately realising that the only person who can determine that is yourself. Character arcs are often at odds with the mechanics of an RPG, where the player gets to have the final say on everything. You don't get to shape Cora, you only get to be her friend, and help her through the journey in the way that you think is best. And to me, that's enough. Together, Liam and Cora are the perfect representation of the Initiative. Optimistic, talented, driven, naive, and flawed. The Initiative couldn't have planned for the Scourge. They couldn't have planned for all the prospects to be dead ends. That's a run of serious bad luck. But there is one thing they really should have planned for, and yet clearly didn't plan very hard. What are they going to do if someone is already living there? There's a spectre that hangs over most sci-fi media, the spectre of colonialism. The final frontier is a very loaded term when you get right down to it, because what were the previous frontiers? The American frontier, when Europeans spent 100 years or so discovering a land where people already lived, and proceeded to try their hardest to wipe out their entire culture and replace it with their own? There's a few dated things in Mass Effect Andromeda, but the thing that's aged the worst is its reverence for SpaceX. One of the ship models you can get for your room is a SpaceX rocket, and an accompanying codex entry explaining that SpaceX was one of the main drivers of future space exploration in the Mass Effect universe. This was not uncommon at the time. Star Trek did the same thing the very same year, because Elon Musk used to be a lot better at pretending to be a real person and not some kind of weird flesh golem powered by racism. In 2017, this reference garnered no controversy or comments beyond cool Easter egg in mainstream coverage. Elon's public persona has thoroughly turned the discourse against SpaceX in the last few years, so it can be hard to remember that SpaceX used to be widely considered extremely cool and popular. People really believed that Elon Musk was going to be the one to get us back into space. It's good that people are now skeptical of everything Elon says and does, but it's worth considering that what he was saying in 2017 about space and Mars was just as iffy then as it is today. Space has a false allure, colonialism without consequence, manifest destiny without all the iffy ethical issues. It's a framework which assumes that the only problem with colonialism was the genocide, and everything else about the mindset of those 18th century pioneers was A-OK. The genocide is a pretty major problem, but it was a natural consequence of the underlying philosophy that says if land and resources can be taken and exploited, then they should be. That's what makes the wheels of progress turn. I mentioned earlier that Andromeda shares a few problems with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and this is not one of them. Andromeda is aware of the space it's playing in, and a significant chunk of the story is spent exploring these ideas, primarily by forcing this space colonial fantasy to reckon with the historical colonial reality. The Helios cluster, where the Initiative has landed in Andromeda, is home to a single species, the Angara. They have names for all the stars you're exploring. They have cities on the planets you're supposed to colonize. They have a military force that's not overly excited to see you. They are a gigantic inconvenience for anyone with colonial interests. Because this is a shooty game and you need someone to shoot, there's also the Kett, but the Kett are religiously fanatical genocidal imperialists who arrived about 80 years ago and have been oppressing the local Angarans for just as long. In a sense, this is the game having its cake and eating it too. It gets to explore uncomfortable truths of the colonial fantasy via the Angara, while also giving you obvious moral superiority no matter what you do, because at least you're not the bony Roman space empire. Another common complaint about Andromeda is that it only introduces 2 new aliens, plus a bunch of ancient robots. And overall, the Helios cluster really isn't that different to the place you left. But that's the point. You can go as far as you want, you can travel for 600 years, and you're still not going to outrun the basic problems of life. You're still going to find petty tyrants and broken promises. You can't escape the shadow of colonialism no matter how far you sail. This was a central irony of Mass Effect 1. We reach the final frontier, and instead of a magic space future, we find ineffectual bureaucracy, messy politics, and all the other problems we thought we were leaving behind. EOS lets you experience the fantasy as it's always portrayed. Rugged individualism and tenacity, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and taming the wilderness like a real American. It's not a coincidence that EOS looks like the backdrop to a spaghetti western. It's evoking these ideas. And the Kett are unapologetically evil, just obviously worse than you in every way. They don't respect the land, they don't bother with diplomacy, they're the bad guys. Shoot them. But when the Angara are introduced, the fantasy shatters. You stumble your way into their capital city, shiny, full of culture, life, and advanced technology, and it's pretty obvious that you're not discovering anything. This is not a story about conquering the frontier, it's a story about immigrating to a nation that's currently at war. At least a third of the game is spent exploring the Angara. They're more fleshed out than pretty much any other alien race in the series. They have to be when you're moving into their home. You learn about their culture, their biology, their history, their political systems, and how their society has evolved and adapted over the last few hundred years especially. There are people who've survived at least 2 catastrophes. When the Scourge hit Helios a few hundred years ago, it decimated the Angaran civilization and sent them into a century-long dark age, erasing a lot of their history. And when they reinvented spaceflight, they were quite shocked to find each other. Because of this, the Angara have evolved slightly different cultures, represented in-game by the Angara having a mix of 3 different regional accents. Just as they were starting to find their footing again, the Ket came and murdered a bunch of their leadership, sending them once again into disarray. It's only very recently that things have gotten back on track and they have a unified resistance against the Ket occupation. And just as all that's going on, you show up on their doorstep. There's a huge amount of Angaran characters in the game, but your primary point of contact is Jal Amadarav, who volunteers to join your crew as a liaison and your escort through Angaran space. He's also the echo of Tali on the crew, the outsider. Jal is extremely likeable. The Angara have a society built around emotional honesty, which means he has no hesitation about cutting to the heart of a conversation. When he's happy, he shows it. When he's suspicious or angry, he lets you know. But he's also friendly, funny, and extremely curious by nature. That's ultimately what led him to volunteer for the crew. A ship full of strange new aliens shows up on his door, and he's eager to learn all about them. Jal is an interesting mirror to the initiative. Jal is the kind of guy who stares up at the stars and wonders what else is out there. He's a guy who's always felt like he doesn't quite fit in with his own people. He's a guy who, if given the option, might have joined the initiative and taken a 600-year journey to the Milky Way. This arguably makes him too quick to trust you and too ready to ignore some of the initiative's genuine problems. Back on the Nexus, when he's not on the ship, Jal hangs out in the Initiative's Cultural Exchange Centre, where the Initiative has set up a bunch of information terminals about the various Milky Way races. And this centre is especially funny as a Mass Effect veteran because it's full of propaganda and historical revisionism. There's a display of a Solarian and a Krogan amicably shaking hands, talking about how the Solarians uplifted the Krogan and in return they saved the galaxy, and then a brief passing mention of their complicated history. It's not technically a lie, but it's a half-truth designed to paint the Initiative as a bunch of friendly, helpful folks, and not a disparate collection of peoples who've been fighting each other for thousands of years. Ephra, the leader of the Angaran resistance, is a lot less gullible than Jal and calls out this hypocrisy more openly. That if the Initiative were truly so enlightened and peaceful, that they wouldn't have arrived fully armed and covered in tactical gear. The Angara are very welcoming people, which makes winning them over easier than it may initially seem, but they've been burned before, and the arrival of the Initiative creates a political schism. You run into a faction of hostile Angara called the Rokar. They're extremely xenophobic and violently opposed to the Initiative, which means fighting them is an inevitability. It's not a coincidence that the Rokar wear orange because they're an Angaran take on Cerberus. Like Cerberus, they are willing to cross ethical lines and use things like bioweapons and false flag attacks to secure Helios for the Angara and the Angara alone. Jal will uncomfortably reveal to you that he used to be friends with the Rokar leader, Aksul. He explains that he used to be a great man, but after spending a year in a Ket labor camp, he came back changed, hateful and bitter, much like the Elusive Man and his experiences during the First Contact War. The political situation with the Angara is already complicated, but it would feel incomplete without the Rokar, because unfortunately no mass migration story is complete without a pack of violent xenophobic assholes spreading stories about how the newcomers are here to breed us out of existence. Flipping the perspective and having this group not be humans makes the Rokar inherently less sympathetic, but there are opportunities to talk to plenty of Rokar members and sympathizers, which makes their perspective more understandable. The Ket are a great example to point to if you're harbouring xenophobic tendencies, because they're everything to fear about outsiders personified. When the Ket first arrived in Helios, they came with a false offer of friendship, which was just a ruse to gather Angara leadership in one place and kill them all. So, when a new group of aliens arrive with the same offer of friendship, it's not unreasonable to be suspicious. It's also clear from your conversations that, like a lot of real hate movements, most Rokar have never actually met anyone from the Milky Way. They've only heard stories. Stories that are warped through an anti-alien lens. This comes to a head during Jal's loyalty mission, when Jal's mothers contact him to let him know that 3 of his siblings have joined the Rokar. They're not bad people, but they've been seduced by a hate movement because of their own ignorance. Axul says there's monsters on the horizon, and with no proof to the contrary, they take up arms to defend their home. The main problem with Andromeda's handling of colonialism is not that it presents a colonialist fantasy. This is not Assassin's Creed Valhalla where you're raiding Angaran churches while the game pats you on the back. Instead, its flaw is that it's too optimistic, and the final confrontation with Axul is the clearest example. Jal wants a chance to speak to Axul face to face to try and argue against his cause. It fails, and Axul tries to shoot him. You have the option of whether or not to let that happen. Jal asked you not to step in because an alien killing Axul would make him a martyr. Jal would rather be the martyr to prove how far Axul has fallen. The game pulls its punch by having Axul miss if you let him shoot because it's not that kind of game. And letting him shoot is the better outcome. He misses. He lives. And his people turn their backs on him when it becomes plain that his rhetoric is not based on logic, but fear and paranoia. It's just too easy. It's a fantasy. The kind of fantasy that could only have been written in the waning years of the Obama administration, when people still had faith that racism and bigotry were fringe beliefs held by only outcast weirdos. Back in 2016, during his first presidential run and in the midst of this game's development, Trump quipped during one of his rallies that he could shoot someone in the middle of the street and he wouldn't lose a single voter. A lot of people dismissed this idea as absurd at the time, a wild exaggeration, surely. But the past decade has proven this statement to be 100% true. In fact, I reckon he'd probably gain more followers for it. Andromeda believes that all of this will work out, that there's a future where the Angara and the Initiative can join forces, work together, value and respect each other's culture, and make a better home for everyone in the cluster. It's not the belief that's the problem. I'm an immigrant. I live in a country I wasn't born in, a country that a few hundred years ago was stolen from its native population. For my own sanity, I have to believe that there's a future where we work it all out. But I am under no illusions that it will be easy. That all it takes is proving yourself to be useful and friendly, and that's enough for everyone to let go of their biases and become immediately accepting and welcoming, and we can quickly transition to the Star Trek Federation future where everything is awesome. It's ironically at odds with Liam's story, where it's not that simple, where you can't rush these things because these things take time. They take effort, they take a hell of a lot of compromise and patience. This is a problem deeper than the naivety of the writers though, it's foundational to the medium. Whatever else it's about, Mass Effect Andromeda is a third-person shooter. Whatever problems you face, they're probably going to end up being solved by shooting some bad guys. Your character and your team have to be the thing that resolves all of the problems, because otherwise they wouldn't be the main characters of the story. For as much as Andromeda pushes against the colonialist fantasy, it can't escape it because that fantasy is embedded into the structure of the game. These are the things that make the game fun. Building up a colony and supporting it with water and resources and security is how you make mechanical progress, just as it is in No Man's Sky or Civilization or Minecraft. The fantasy of the frontier, despite all its flaws, continues to captivate us, especially in video games. And that's a deep-rooted cultural bias that Mass Effect Andromeda was never going to solve. Another problem with all of this is the Kett, who are very boring. The Kett represent a much larger shift in storytelling than anything else in the game because they're the first fully evil civilization in the series, not counting the Reapers as a true civilization. The decision was made to create a more down-to-earth threat than the Reapers, which was a smart choice. The Kett have a technology level roughly on par with the Angara and the Initiative, they just have more resources. What they don't have is personality. An early revelation in the game is that the Kett foot soldiers you spend most of the game fighting are, or were, corrupted Angara. The Kett use some kind of magic serum to turn other races into Kett. This is not a hard twist to guess, especially since a lot of the Kett's battle animals are clearly versions of normal animals you can find out in the open world, but it's also a very similar story beat to the Reapers and their husks. There are contextual differences, the underlying metaphor is different. As mentioned, the Kett are evocative of the Roman Empire. Part of how the Roman Empire succeeded was its ability to adapt the cultures it subsumed to its own ends, as well as conscripting the citizenship into the army so that no matter who you were, everyone was Roman, or a slave. The Ket take this strategy and apply it biologically. They are genetic imperialists. They take not only the resources of the cultures they conquer, but their genetic material. Essentially a biological version of the Borg. They will add your uniqueness to their own. They call this process exaltation and seem to view it with some kind of religious reverence. And they work fast. Around halfway through the game you encounter a Krogan who's already close to full exaltation. This is an interesting enough idea that's unfortunately made less interesting because I've seen it before. The low-level Ket are basically just the collectors. They're brainwashed drones. It's only the higher-level Ket, the ones who weren't Angara, where you get any kind of culture or personality. Other Ket forces in the game appear to be exalted versions of races that aren't in the game, from other parts of the galaxy that would likely be explored in a sequel. But the ones you meet seem to have much more autonomy and individual personality, implying that whoever they were, they've been successfully indoctrinated into the system. The big bad of the game is the Archon, who leads the campaign within the Helios cluster. He's not the ruler of the Empire. Helios is at the fringes of the Ket Empire, which potentially spans a large portion of the Andromeda galaxy. The Archon is the only pure Ket in the game, implying that his race is the progenitor of the whole project. And as such, he's one of the only Ket in the game that has any actual agency. Unfortunately, he uses that agency to be a really bland, generic villain. He's a vainglorious, authoritarian asshole who keeps getting in your way and getting really annoyed at your interference, while insisting that you're an insect beneath notice. For the story that Andromeda is telling, he doesn't really need to be more than that. He's an obstacle, not an antagonist. But the extreme fleshing out of the Angara makes a very bad contrast with the severe lack of fleshing out of the Ket. There's only one side quest in the game that gives you a more concrete look inside the Empire, and like many side quests in the game, it's easy to miss as you go scan another rock. There is dissent amongst the ranks. The Archon's second in command, the Primus, schemes against her boss because the Archon has gone rogue and stopped reporting back to the Imperial Senate. To her mind, he's become too obsessed with understanding the remnant technology, and has abandoned the pure and righteous goal of the Ket, which is to exalt the cluster and bring it into the Empire. So there is conflict, but the conflict is that the Archon is being the wrong kind of asshole. More than anything else in the game, the Ket suffer from first game syndrome. BioWare made no secret of the fact that Andromeda was supposed to be the start of a new series. What we see of the Ket in this game was never supposed to be all that we see of the Ket, in the same way that the evil chirping robots in Mass Effect 1 were never supposed to be all that we saw of the Geth. Which personally, I didn't care much at all about until Legion in Mass Effect 2. Unfortunately, we never got a Ket Legion, so what we have is all we've got, and what we've got is an empire of bone-faced assholes with a very ugly taste in architecture. Just as the Angara are too easy to make peace with, the Ket are too easy to shoot. They have no redeeming qualities, and that's what makes them boring. As I've been known to say, satisfying murder requires satisfying motivation. The game is not completely devoid of cynicism, it just saves most of this cynicism not for the Angara or the Ket, but for the Nexus exiles. It turns out that first contact with the Angara was not actually first contact. When the exiles left the Nexus, they made their way to an Angaran outpost called Kadara, and immediately seized control of the port for themselves. Sloane Kelly, the Nexus's former chief of security, rules the port with an iron fist. As the de facto ruler of the exiles, she's transformed them from a band of pissed-off colonists into a ruthless criminal gang. The exiles are a very uncomfortable subject for the Initiative. They primarily exist because of a total failure in leadership from Tan. And their general perspective is understandable. Like everyone, they were sold a dream, and then they arrived and it turned out that dream was a crock of shit. Rather than doubling down on trying to make the dream a reality like Liam, a lot of people just got bitter and resentful. Some even got conspiratorial and started wondering if maybe this whole thing was some kind of elaborate scam. While the Initiative may have appealed to the dreamers, it also appealed to the folks who had something to run from. Another galaxy offered a fresh start and a future where all prior sins are forgiven. But some people were probably on the run for a reason, and when times are tough, old habits die hard. There are a lot of exiles out in the open world who are immediately hostile, mostly so there's a faction of enemy humans and other Milky Way races to fight, which stretches believability a little bit, mostly in how numerous they are, but it's a concession to gameplay. The exiles represent a much more problematic and dangerous approach to colonialism than the Initiative does. None more so than Sloane Kelly herself. Sloane signed on for the dream, but she was also a personal friend of Jean Garson. In Sloane's mind, when Garson died, her dream died with her, and all that's left now are the cold, amoral realities of survival. Ruthless pragmatism has its advantages. On a material level, Sloane's outcasts are doing much better than the Nexus. They have a defendable fortress and they have ample resources. But they've done this by stealing from the Angara and the Initiative, and on a social level they're doing very poorly. Sloane has kept her people alive, but to do it she's become an authoritarian invader not much better than the Kett. And this makes her extremely unsympathetic and hard to like, even if she may have initially started with a point. Resolving the Exile plotline is one of the most annoyingly elaborate quests in the game because it involves leaving and coming back to Kadar multiple times to trigger different parts of the quest. This is because a big part of the storyline revolves around a smuggler called Reyes Vidal. You're initially introduced to Reyes because he's working as a spy for Ifra, who himself is keeping an eye on the situation and looking for ways to undermine Sloane's authority. Reyes is much more likeable than Sloane. He's essentially a Spanish Han Solo. Charming, adventurous, devilishly flirtatious, all qualities that get him into a lot of trouble. But also, much like Han Solo, actually hide a lot of personal insecurities and self-doubt. At least, that's what he shows you. Sloane's gang, the Outcasts, are stuck in a turf war with an up-and-coming gang called the Collective, led by a mysterious figure known only as the Charlatan, and I bet you've already figured out who it is. The twist being obvious doesn't make it less interesting, especially when it comes down to the final choice. Sloane is a despot, but she's a predictable despot. She doesn't lie, cheat, or pretend to be anything else. What you see is what you get. Reyes is much more likeable in both personality and in policy, but he's also a lying snake. He manipulated you to his own ends, and his greater ambitions are a mystery. The devil you know, or the devil you don't. I love the way this choice is presented. Reyes reveals himself to Sloane and challenges her to a duel. Winner takes the port. But the game is rigged. Reyes is just goading her to get her into position for a sniper to take her out. If you don't interfere, she'll die. The honourable thing to do is to save her. Reyes is a liar and a cheat. On the other hand, Sloane really sucks. Reyes may be a snake, but maybe a snake is better than a raging bull. So maybe you just stand there and pretend you didn't notice the sniper. This isn't a dialogue choice, it's an interrupt. You don't have time to pause and think about it, you just have a few seconds to make a gut decision and live with the consequences. Personally, I chose to just stand there. Whether it's honourable or not, the cluster is much better off with Sloane out of the picture. Especially since, whatever else his ambitions may be, Reyes is no despot. He reinstates an Angara as head of Kadar Port and puts an end to the protection racket the Outcast had been running. He's slimy, sleazy, and untrustworthy, but I think I'd still take the guy who at least pretends not to be an asshole over the person who unapologetically is one. Kadara feels like a more honest exploration of the frontier because it's the only plot thread where there isn't a neat resolution. You pick whichever crime boss you can tolerate more and settle into an uneasy peace. There's still problems, there's still things to work through. Bridges have been burned down and it takes a long time to build those up again. It's a resolution where things are on a path to being better, but are not there yet, and that strikes me as more true. There's no exiles on your crew, for obvious reasons, but the exile perspective is represented by Vetra Nyx, Turian Requisitions Officer and the game's echo of Garrus. Not just because she's a Turian, but because they share similar frustrations with regulations and red tape. But Vetra comes at it from the opposite perspective. Garrus was a cop, and Vetra grew up a crook. Having been raised outside of Turian society, she never had the mandatory military service required of all Turian citizens. But she had to learn how to fight anyway, growing up bouncing between various smuggling and mercenary organisations to pay the bills. And more importantly, look out for her kid sister Sid after they were abandoned by their parents. Vetra came to Andromeda because she wanted to leave that life behind. There may have been a few old enemies to escape, but mostly she wanted something better for herself and her sister, and the Initiative seemed like the best bet. Then shit hit the fan and she found that all of her old skills were too useful to give up. Vetra has a lot more sympathy for the Exile's position than most people on the Nexus because Vetra is a former cynic trying her best to be an optimist. She's the opposite of Garrus. Garrus was itching to break the rules that got in the way of his job. Vetra is trying her best not to break the rules even when she knows she can get more things done without them. She gets why the Exiles are pissed. They tried to leave a bad life behind and found themselves in an even worse one. That's enough to break people. It might have been enough to break her if it wasn't for her sister. She holds on to hope because she's trying to set a better example for Sid. She doesn't want her to have to grow up as fast as she did and is trying to maintain her childish, bubbly naivety a little bit longer. But Sid has picked up a little more than she lets on from her sister and ends up getting herself in trouble trying to help some exiles who want a second chance. Which is the setup for Vetra's loyalty mission. Vetra's mistake was trying to hide parts of herself away, assuming that just because she didn't share them, her sister wouldn't know about them. Her arc is simply learning to be more honest, both with her sister and with herself. The mistakes of the past are doomed to be repeated if you don't learn from them. Her past is a part of her. It taught her all that she knows. There were bad times, but good times too. And all of that history makes her who she is, and will help her build the better world that she dreams of. Everyone brought some baggage to Andromeda, but none more than the Krogan. The Krogan had a bigger need for a fresh start than most, which is why the entirety of Clan Nakmor agreed to join the initiative and hitched a ride along with the Nexus. But it's one thing to talk about a fresh start and another to put words into action. To say that the game has no criticisms of Musk's vision for space is inaccurate. It simply has the wrong criticisms. Gene Garson was an Elon Musk-esque figure, a 2017 Elon Musk-esque figure. An eccentric billionaire with wild dreams and wild ambitions. The sort of person everyone would describe as a visionary. The game doesn't explore Gene Garson much as a character because she died a year before the game begins. Instead, the game asks what Garson's dream means without Garson in it, without her cult of personality to keep everything on track. You can talk about leaving history behind, building a future where everyone works together as equals, but unfortunately you can't just go to sleep for 600 years and wake up free of bigotry and bias. Tan's big sin during the Nexus Uprising was that when the uprising began, he woke up the Krogan early and made a deal with them to stamp it out. A total repetition of history, including the part afterwards where the Krogan demanded more power and influence within the initiative's chain of command, and Tan refused. Recognizing the pattern, the Krogan took all their stuff and left. Only Kesh remained to make sure that at least one Krogan retained a voice on the Nexus. Tan is very happy with this result because Tan is pretty openly anti-Krogan, describing them as violent, mindless savages. Same shit, different galaxy. This is a fair interrogation of the billionaire space future. Leaving Earth behind does not mean suddenly leaving all of our baggage behind. Without resolving any of our current issues, it's just as likely that the space race turns into the Martian turf war between the US and China. The mistake was the assumption that folks like Elon actually want to leave the baggage behind, when we know now that Elon is the champion of the Martian ethno-state. He's not the Gene Garson, he's the Tan. Andromeda has a much more nuanced take on the Krogan than any other game in the series, specifically because unlike a lot of the traditionalist assholes like Reeve across the trilogy, every Krogan in Andromeda is here because they were willing to change. Nakmor was an ally of Rex and supported his reforms back in Mass Effect 2, before they all left to join the initiative. Unlike the Exiles, the Krogan don't turn to crime and exploitation. Their goal at their colony on Elodin is to be self-sufficient, and they're succeeding better than anyone else. They're hardy folk who can live in harsh conditions, which certainly helps, but they've got food, running water, they even have farms. These people came for a fresh start, and they're going to build one in spite of all the assholes on the Nexus who assume they're incapable of it. This is best explored through your Krogan companion, Nakmor Drak, grandfather of Kesh and the game's echo of Rex. Drak is the oldest companion in the series, with a good 4 centuries on Rex. But more than that, Drak is an examination of what it really means to live for 1,000 years, to see civilizations rise and fall around you and the wisdom that comes with it. Drak is introduced as a very traditional Krogan. He's killing Kit, he's covered in bones of past conquests, he charges headlong into battle shotgun in hand. But the more you get to know him, the more layers of Drak are revealed. He's a lot more sentimental than he lets on, and he cares about people a lot more than he'd ever show. Drak fought in the Krogan rebellions as a young man. He was there when the Genophage was deployed, and he's watched over the centuries as Krogan civilization collapsed. It's a lot harder to glorify the past when you actually lived it, but Drak is no leader. He's not a visionary like Rex. Drak is just a soldier. Just because he can see the problems with his society doesn't mean that he has the talent or the drive to fix them. Despite his appearance of confidence and cockiness, Drac sees himself as more of a ghost than a person, a relic from a time that probably should be forgotten. He's coming to the end of his life, partly from age and partly from a millennia of compounding battle injuries. His design doesn't make this super obvious, but he is at this point mostly a cyborg. One of his arms, one of his legs, his spine, he's being held together with a lot of duct tape and glue. For a time, he was ready to give up on life entirely, but then a shaman dumped a little baby girl in his lap. Fragile for a Krogan, too weak to survive on her own. But she was smart, a builder. The two of them looked out for each other, and when she approached him with this crazy idea of going to another galaxy, he agreed to tag along. Drac is not a reformer, he's not an agent of change, but he also refuses to be one of stagnation. Drac is the kind of grandpa who won't hug you at family get-togethers because he's too much of a manly man to show any vulnerability. But he'll also fully finance your gay wedding and beat the hell out of anyone who tries to tell you it's wrong. He may not understand it, he may not want it for himself, but he will fight for it nonetheless. His arc, though, is about moving past that to let himself be a part of the future and not just its defender, to learn that you're never too old to change. Drac's loyalty quest revolves around a very boring rivalry with a dude called Spender, Addison's assistant, who's one of the people responsible for screwing over the Krogan during the uprising. He's extremely bland, but it gets a pass because that's only the background for what the quest is actually about. The Krogan colony's seed vault has been stolen, a ship containing all of the seeds they need to grow crops. It's not the sort of thing Drac understands, other than the fact that it's important that the colony have food, but he sees it as his job to go get it back, and he asks you to tag along. You also discover partway through the mission that along with the vault, the Krogan's chief botanist, Vorn, was also stolen. Mordin once quipped back in Mass Effect 2 that he's never met a Krogan scientist worthy of the term, but that was some cultural bias on his part because here's one. Vorn is not a warrior, he's a bumbling, dorky scientist who's really good at plants. Pretty much every Krogan in the trilogy, including Rex, would have looked down on Vorn for being so fragile. He would not have survived on Tuchanka. Even Drac instinctively berates him. But then there's a wonderful little moment when a dying goon takes a shot of Drac and Vorn dives to take the bullet. It misses both of them and Drac immediately starts yelling at him. Vorn giving his life for Drac? That's stupid. Idiotic. Vorn is the future of their people, not an old fossil like Drac. He is expendable. Getting shot is the only thing he's good for. There's a lot of self-loathing in that argument. Drac doesn't want to be a legend. He doesn't want to inspire anyone to sacrifice themselves on his account. He's not personally responsible for the fall of the Krogan, but his generation and their attitudes are what destroyed them. Travelling with you helps Drac feel like he has a purpose again. Like maybe there's a place for his old bones in this new world. In an epilogue scene it's revealed that Kesh and Vorn are expecting. Drac will teach those kids how to defend themselves. But he'll also teach them history, why it's important, and why things are different now. Reckoning with the past is a major theme with the Krogan storyline overall. The main plot in Eladin is a rivalry between the head of Clan Nakmor, Morda, and a would-be usurper named Jorgal Strux. He feeds you a story about Morda being an unstable and violent leader, but in reality he's trying to undermine her because of an ancient rivalry between their two clans. Morda is violent. She's a much more traditional Krogan than Kesh, Vorn, or even Drac. But she brought her clan here for a reason and won't be stupid enough to hold on to a 1,000-year-old grudge. If you want to get the Krogan back into the initiative, you have to trust them. Morda wants a powerful remnant drive core for their settlement. It could be used as a power source, or it could be used as a bomb. Morda says she wants it as a power source, and if you trust her with it, then she'll honour the bargain and let you join the initiative settlement with the Krogans. If you don't trust her, then the Krogan will close their borders and tell you to go fuck yourself. To move past history, you have to be willing to move past history. You have to let go of old biases and grudges and make bold choices. You can't just go to sleep for 600 years and wake up no longer racist. But you can change things if you're willing to put in the effort. The Remnant are a very useful shortcut to change. While it's a similar story beat to the Prothean ruins in the trilogy, Remnant technology plays a much more active role in the story of Andromeda. Your magic power as a protagonist and the reason you're able to get so much done is that you're the only person who's able to activate Remtech thanks to Sam, who's able to decipher the Remnant language and interface at a superhuman level. Like the kit, there's a lot about the Remnant that's left unexplored, however there is enough information to get the broad strokes. The Jordan, as you later learn they were called, were world builders. They built ecosystems and creatures to fill those ecosystems, including, as it turns out, the Angara. Unlike the Protheans, the Jordan have not been gone for millennia, only a few hundred years. The Scourge was a weapon deployed against them, which is why it's drawn to Remnant technology, and in response to it, they fled the system, leaving all their technology behind. The chances that they're still out there are high, as are the chances that whoever their enemy was that deployed the Scourge is still out there as well, and considering their lack of knowledge about all of this, it seems unlikely that it was the kit. There's a lot to speculate on, and plenty of directions the story could go with the Jordan, but speculation feels annoyingly redundant in a world where it seems unlikely that any of it will ever be resolved. Although I do have slightly more faith in seeing this stuff folded into Mass Effect 5 than the kit, since one of the only things we do know about the game is that there's at least one Angara in it. Part of the reason that so much of the Remnant remain a mystery is that your resident Remnant expert doesn't know any more than you do. How could she? She found them at the same time you did. Peebee is Andromeda's most divisive companion, which is not surprising given her whole deal. Peebee is a young Asari scientist and archaeologist who is of course the game's echo of Liara. But beyond obvious broad-stroke similarities, the two couldn't be more different. When you first meet her, Peebee is very annoying. She has an overly blasé, casual attitude that gives the impression of someone trying way too hard to come across as cool. She won't answer any questions about herself, she acts performatively bored anytime she's not on a mission, and she's just as reckless, if not more reckless than Liam when out on missions. Despite being over 100 years old, she has the personality of an especially annoying teenager. You can't tell me what to do, Mum. She is smart, she is a scientist, but as she explains it, she decided to start studying the Remnant essentially on a whim because she was bored of all the drama and depression on the Nexus. She has a callous disregard for the Initiative and its survival. Despite being an Asari, she's way less motivated to find the Asari arc than Cora is, something which frustrates Cora a great deal. However, as you get to know Peebee, the less any of this seems true. Pelisari Basale gives the impression of someone trying way too hard to seem cool because that's exactly what she's doing. The story Peebee tells you about why she came to Andromeda, for the adventure, is a lie. Peebee actually came to Andromeda because of her girlfriend, Kalinda. Kalinda used her influence to wake Peebee up early and then proceeded to hold that over Peebee, making her dependent on her kindness and influence, since she was technically an outlaw on the Nexus. She was emotionally abusive, constantly stringing Peebee along with promises that she'd do better when she never did. Eventually, she just stopped calling entirely, and it's after that when you find Peebee on Eos. Peebee's too cool for school attitude is a defense mechanism. Her experience with Kalinda has left her with serious trust and abandonment issues. When she joins the crew, she sets up all her stuff in an escape pod because she feels most secure in a place where she can make a quick exit whenever she wants. She has deeply internalized the philosophy that close relationships are a trap, and if you let anyone get too close, it's only so they can burn you. When you get to know Peebee and do earn her trust, you find her to be a lot more emotionally vulnerable, scared and nervous than she's trying to project. And all of this is why she's the most interesting romance in the game. There's definitely similarities to Jack's romance back in Mass Effect 2, including the option for casual sex, although casual sex with Peebee will not close out the option for a romance later. But like with Jack, the tone between casual and serious intimacy is completely different. In the casual scene, she's in control, she's cool and collected. In the true romance scene, she's nervous and exposed. This is Peebee's arc regardless if a romance or not, but a romance enhances the arc by making this emotional honesty even more of a focus. For most of the game, Peebee avoids dealing with her feelings by throwing herself into research, but this eventually turns into a rivalry when Kalinda re-enters the picture after the same tech Peebee is after. Kalinda is not a scientist and only knows about this stuff at all because she's been keeping tabs on her ex. After several weeks of Kalinda screwing you and Peebee over, it comes down to a final choice. Kalinda is on the edge of a volcano, so is the Remtech. Peebee instinctively goes to save Kalinda, and it's up to you if you're going to let her do it, or if you're going to shoot Kalinda in the back and make sure she dies. I'm not sure what it says about me that when you remove the Paragon Renegade branding, I suddenly seem to pick a lot more of the Renegade coded actions, but I shot Kalinda dead. My motivation wasn't revenge, but for PB's own good. Kalinda has proven herself a manipulator. Sure, she may be sincerely thankful for a time, but at what point does "you saved my life" just become another tool in her arsenal? Emotional abuse like the kind that Kalinda put PB through is extremely hard to break out of. And seeing PB instinctively reach for Kalinda, instinctively give her another chance which she doesn't deserve, I felt strongly that I shouldn't let that happen. The best way out of a relationship like that is a hard out. I suppose there's an argument to be made that isn't my call to make, but the game gave me that call, and I made it, and I don't feel particularly bad about it. Regardless of what you pick, PB's final scene is to call a team meeting where she sheepishly and awkwardly announces that she's ready to join the team. She's ready to let herself be a part of this strange little found family. The rest of them don't really get why she's making such a big thing of it, but it doesn't matter because for her this is an incredibly important step. She's ready to trust. She's ready to stop pretending she doesn't care. She's ready to be vulnerable again. Andromeda's light-hearted, sometimes goofy tone does not mean that it's incapable of exploring deeper emotional themes. The cozier atmosphere of the game just presents a more optimistic outlook and resolution for them. If there's one idea that permeates the whole game, it's the belief that things can get better, whether it's environments, organizations, or people themselves. The Tempest is populated by a few more non-combat members. It's a much smaller ship, so there are no nameless NPCs walking about. Everyone on the Tempest is a character. Their arcs are not as in-depth as the full companions, but they all share a commonality. They're nice, honest, helpful people trying to do their best in a bad situation. The first one you meet, and actually the first character you meet in the game, is Dr. Lexi Tapero, voiced by Natalie Dormer, who was hot off the heels of Game of Thrones at the time. Lexi is a much more traditional Asari than PB, although she is notably not a romance option, preferring not to fraternise with her patients. And she isn't really looking for a relationship besides. Lexi is empathetic and kind, with just the hint of mad scientist behind her eyes whenever she gets a new specimen to study. She's very much a stabilising element and often plays the role of adult in the room for some of the other characters' more reckless tendencies. If Drac is the team grandpa, then Lexi is the team's mum. She's a strange fit for the initiative because she seems a little too responsible to make such a life-altering change, but this is part of her arc. Despite her talent and professionalism, she doesn't really know what she's doing with her life. She has 3 different degrees because she's never settled on a path, which is both a blessing and a curse of living for hundreds of years. But eventually she finds her place on the Tempest. It wasn't the job she'd planned to do in Andromeda, but it's the one she got, and she rises to the challenge. It's a simple arc, but an effective one, and the Tempest is better for her part in the ensemble. By far the best writing in Andromeda is how it builds, maintains, and evolves the web of interpersonal dynamics between all the different members of the Tempest crew. Relationships which grow and evolve completely separately from the player. Lexi and PB are a good example. They may be the 2 Asari on the ship, but they really don't like each other. They argue constantly and avoid each other otherwise. This is mostly because Lexi is a trained psychiatrist as well as a physician and can read PB like an open book. But also because part of PB's backstory is that she had a bunch of older, overbearing, condescending sisters back in the Milky Way, which is a role that Lexi fits into a little too easily. But it goes the other way too. PB really knows how to push Lexi's buttons and break her usual calm and collected demeanour. On the other hand, Lexi clearly has a little bit of a crush on Drac. She certainly worries about him more than anyone else, not that she'd ever admit it or act on it. Jal and Liam might be your bros, but their biggest bros are each other. Vetra and Liam, though, really just don't get on at all, but Vetra does get the grandpa treatment from Drac because she's friends with Kesh. Not every relationship is mapped out like this, but most of them are. As you walk around the Tempest, the crew are constantly talking to each other, and these conversations range from poking fun at each other to genuine emotional moments between friends. The most obvious of these dynamics is the growing rivalry between Gil and Callow. Gil Brody is the Tempest engineer. He's an extremely casual, almost slackery kind of guy. He's a talented engineer, but also the sort of engineer who uses the instruction manual to prop up his desk, while he stands on it to tape up a dodgy vent. His arc is about learning to take things a little more seriously. Gil joined the initiative on a whim. He didn't put much thought into it, and that's worked out super well for him so far. His best friend, Jill, is the head of the initiative's population efforts, and eventually she asks Gil to be the father of her child. This is not something Gil had ever really thought about, considering he's gay and a bit of a playboy besides, but he decides to accept. The whole thing is a little more complicated if you're romancing Gil, which you can only do as a male writer. But I think without that element, it's still a very modern kind of story beat, one that speaks to the complexities of real human relationships. Who says you have to be straight and married or attracted to each other to have a kid together? That's not the important bit. The important bit is that you're a team, that you get each other, and that you trust each other's ability to handle one of the most stressful things a person can do. In that department, whether he'd admit it or not, Gil could learn a thing or two from his rival. Calo Jath is your pilot. As far as pilots go, Joker is an impossible act to follow, so Calo is a very different sort of guy. He's a Solarian for one, but also an introverted nerd, not a cocky maverick. Calo was the test pilot for the Tempest as it was being built, and so has a personal connection to the ship deeper than anyone else. He was the only member of the team to join the initiative, so he's a little bit haunted by their memories as he walks the halls of the ship, and enraged when Gil starts ripping the walls off to install random nonsense. He takes any modifications much more personally than is really reasonable, and eventually he realises this and comes to terms with the fact that the ship can evolve and change without dishonouring his old friends. The last member of the crew is Suvi Anwar, the science officer, who gets all the points for being a Scottish person voiced by a real Scottish person. Looking at you, Ken Donnelly. Suvi is very much an absent-minded professor type. She's very excited to talk about science and discovery, but often forgets the basic stuff, like the coffee only stays in the cup when it's upright. Complexity is added to her when you learn that on top of this she's also highly spiritual. The game doesn't pin her down to any one religion in particular, but she believes strongly in a divine creator. You can get into a debate with her about it if you want, but her faith is far too strong to be broken by a few basic questions. She's also a lesbian, just to really throw you off your game. Overall, it's a crew of eclectic misfits, a lot of people who you'd never expect to be friends, but that's the real magic of the game. Clashing, contrary personalities coming together to solve problems. More than any of the sci-fi aspects, that's the thing that gives it that Star Trek feeling. People working around their differences to make the whole crew stronger. The game finally takes a thing from Dragon Age where the crew talk to each other while you're out on missions, as well as the thing from Mass Effect 3 where the crew move around the ship between missions, and when you're docked at a port, the crew are all out and about doing their own thing. Some of my favourite writing in the game is in your emails and the crew notice board. These are used for all the little character interactions that wouldn't fit in a proper conversation. Things like Drac falling for phishing scams, Liam sending you motivational movies, Jal's Angarn word of the day, or PB sharing the feeling she's too embarrassed to say in person. And of course, there's Liam's movie night, which ends up being a crew-wide affair trying to get the whole thing set up just right. It's not the same tone as the trilogy, outside of the Citadel DLC, because the trilogy is about soldiers and mercenaries and warrior monks. Andromeda is about people. Normal people thrust into the role of heroes, coming together to meet the moment. This is the biggest thing about Ryder as a protagonist. They are not Shepard. They don't have the experience. They don't command the same amount of respect. They are not nearly as competent. Paragon and Renegade are both stances of supreme confidence in yourself and your beliefs. Ryder lacks that confidence, at least to begin with. As much as I love Shepard, they were always a larger-than-life figure, a hero in a very traditional hero way. At least a Paragon Shepard is. Ryder always feels much more down-to-earth, much more human, and I'm not saying that's better or worse, but it is a difference I appreciate. Because Ryder has a family unrelated to the events of the game or even the other companions, Ryder also gets what is in effect their own loyalty mission. When he transferred Sam to his kid, Alec Ryder also transferred some of his memories, along with mental locks so that they're not all available at once. They tell the story of the Ryder family, as well as why exactly Alec joined the initiative and brought his kids with him. You experience these memories alongside Sam, who's not just a helpful AI assistant, but part of Ryder's physiology. Unfortunately, Sam is a lot more interesting conceptually than he is as a character. AI research is illegal in the Milky Way, but the Initiative got a pass because they were leaving, although mostly because they were pretty cagey about what they were actually doing. But AI research was a core part of the Initiative, and not just because their initials happened to spell AI, although that is a very convenient coincidence. Sam is bonded to Ryder. He sees through their eyes, feels what they feel, and enhances all of their abilities while out in the field. It's not too dissimilar from Synthesis back in Mass Effect 3, or the Overlord DLC in Mass Effect 2. In fact, there's a major side quest in the game about a mother and son who escaped Project Overlord and tried to destroy Sam over fears of the same thing happening again. Sam is fully sentient, but for most of the game he doesn't express all that much personality. He speaks robotically and professionally, much like Edie towards the beginning of Mass Effect 2, before her personality is developed. But unlike Edie, Sam never moves past that, which feels like another case of first game syndrome. Undoubtedly, Sam would have continued to be an important part of the series, especially since it's established that because of this bonding process, Ryder now needs Sam in order to live. There's one point in the game where Sam stops your heart, just for a moment, so you can escape a stasis field. It's a big WTF moment for a lot of characters in the game, especially Lexi, because it has uncomfortable implications. Back in Mass Effect 3, Javik told you the story of the Za and the Zatil, who were the Quarians and the Geth of his cycle. The Za implanted themselves with symbiotic AI technology, but then the AI turned on them, moulding and distorting their organic forms into horrific abominations, the Zatil. This is exactly what Sam can do to you, which is why some characters on the ship, like Drag, really don't like Sam and find the whole thing pretty disturbing. Sam is with you for every single fight, every conversation, every intimate moment, watching, feeling, sharing. You're pretty much playing Sam as much as you're playing Ryder, and during a dramatic moment in the story that becomes even more obvious. The Archon boards and attacks the human Ark, having figured out that it's Sam that allows Ryder to use the Remnant technology, so he severs the connection and Ryder passes out. Control then switches to whichever Ryder twin you didn't pick back on the Ark, as Sam walks them through the process of saving their sibling's life. I've always wondered if this was BioWare flirting with the idea of a dual protagonist system in the next game, where you play as both Ryders, something akin to Assassin's Creed Syndicate. But as per, that's in the realm of daydreams and random speculation. But it is another thing that makes Ryder feel more down to earth. You are not unique in the world. There is another equally capable protagonist out there who's just happened to get unlucky when you were in character creation. I really do wish Sam was a more interesting character, considering his narrative and thematic importance. Unfortunately, his most memorable personality trait ends up being his love of telling you about the weather. This symbiotic take on AI is where the game feels most connected to the trilogy's themes of organics versus synthetics. After all, doesn't this union, if it keeps working out, prove the Starchild even more wrong? There's more to this than just speculation. While Alec Ryder's memories tell the story of the Ryder family, they also introduce new mysteries and old connections. The initiative may have been the brainchild of Jean Garson, but it was really pushed forward and funded by a mysterious, faceless benefactor, who rushed the initiative into action much faster than the initial plans. This is because the benefactor knew about the Reapers. For most of the colonists, the initiative was a fresh start and a bold dream and all that, but the truth is that the initiative is a backup plan for civilization. 100,000 refugees who will keep their species alive should galactic extinction occur. It's a twist for the characters, but not really a twist for the players. Finding this memory also unlocks a few fairly dark audio logs in Alec's office, a few emergency SOSs from Earth and Palaven, as well as a message from Liara, who was aware of the initiative and sent a message to Alec during the events of Mass Effect 3, making her the only character to appear in every game in the series so far. Funnily enough, this also ties into Elon Musk's vision for Mars. From the beginning, Musk has always said that he sees it as important to colonize Mars because we need a backup planet in case anything catastrophic happens to Earth. Which is the sort of thing only bored billionaires worry about here in the real world, but in Mass Effect that is a genuine concern. The identity of the benefactor is left a mystery for future games, as is their future intentions, since another aspect of the mystery is the revelation that Jean Garson was murdered, not simply lost during the Scourge disaster. It certainly seems like the sort of scheming the elusive man would get up to, though he would be less inclined to bring along the rest of the Milky Way species. another mystery that may or may not ever be addressed again. I'm not particularly mad that Andromeda doesn't answer all of these questions, for the same reason I'm not mad that Mass Effect 1 didn't explain where the Reapers came from, or what Cerberus' goals were. You're allowed to leave a few things open-ended for later, even if later never comes to pass. I think these are the best connections back to the trilogy, the big connections with heavy implications. There are a lot of other less necessary connections that start to stretch believability just a little bit, especially in the side quests. Tyrion Kandros is the cousin of Nyreen Kandros. You run into Zaid's bastard son out on Eos. Conrad Werner's sister is on Kadara. Alec Ryder was a personal friend of Castus Vicarian. There's a few Krogan who are studying the research of Dr. O'Keir, and the first human born in Andromeda is to be named David Edward, after an old friend. I suppose it's not that much more ridiculous than happening to run into every single one of your previous companions over the course of Mass Effect 3. It just feels a little more absurd given the context. I get the impulse, but Andromeda is at its best when it's being its own thing. It doesn't need these connections to remind me of what I'm playing. There is one part of Andromeda that's unequivocally better than Mass Effect 3, and that's the ending. The bulk of Andromeda's main story is about the search for Meridian, the central control of the Remnant terraforming network. The Archon wants to use it and your sibling to foul everything up and make all the planets lifeless because he's a bad guy. So you gather every ally you've made throughout the game to make one final push. It's a cinematic spectacle that reflects all of the choices you've made throughout the game. Which fellow Pathfinders you've chosen, Reyes or Sloan, whether or not you trusted the Krogan, even if you killed or saved Peewee's ex, it all folds back in at the end. All of your companions join in the fight, not just the ones you pick for your squad. There's only one choice left to make, and it's a comparatively minor one. Really, this is just a big celebratory firework, the culmination of everything you've been working towards. A chance to see the fruits of your labour, uniting the cluster and working together to build a future. Most of Meridian's secrets are left for a sequel to explore, but your final choice is a thematically important one. Who will be the ambassador of Helios? Who will represent the cluster and oversee this new world you're creating? You have 4 choices, each of them represented by a different part of the tone wheel. Will it be August Bradley, the head of the Eos colony, a man of the people? The Solarian Pathfinder, a political choice that cements the initiative's power? Will it be Nakmor Morda, an even greater act of trust in the Krogan? For me, there's only one correct answer, and that's Moshae Sepha. The Moshae is Jal's mentor, and a mix between spiritual leader and chief scientist. She's actually one of my favourite characters in the game. She's built up in a way that makes you assume she'll be some kind of wise, cryptic spirit guide, but when you meet her, she's just a completely normal person. A scientifically minded mum with a love of sarcasm, who never asked or wanted to be a spiritual leader, she just became one accidentally on the back of everybody liking her. She's the most qualified person for the job, and really the only person who should have it, because Helios' fate should be decided by the Angara, not the Initiative. Tan is very annoyed if you pick this option, to which Addison of all people chastises him for being such a colonial wad. It's not as dramatic as charging the Citadel, not as impactful as the suicide mission, but it's the ending that Andromeda was always building towards, and I think that's enough. The game does leave one very obvious loose thread hanging. While you're running around having your epilogue chats with the companions and some of the game's major NPCs, there's one person who's picked up a signal from the Quarian Ark, the one arc you never find in the game, with a big obvious, "we'll just have to wait for now" wink at the end of the conversation. It's an extremely obvious setup for a DLC expansion that never happened. All DLC plans were cancelled when the game underperformed, and the team who built the game spent their last few months trying to fix the game before the team was laid off. And that's a damn shame. This is where the metaphor ends. The Initiative had a rough start, they ran into a bunch of problems, they had poorly laid plans, but in the end they pulled it together and they built something that will last. And unfortunately, things did not go the same for BioWare Montreal. As I was writing this video, Tom Taylorson, the voice of Scott Ryder, came out swinging against EA for the game's failure, and he's not entirely wrong. Engine troubles were certainly a part of the game's issues, and it was an EA mandate that they use the Frostbite engine, but it's not the only issue. He also called out the, not so diplomatic critics of the game, an aspect which I've avoided because I don't think it's fair to lump those people in with the genuine critics of the game who have real issues with it, but there was certainly a lot of misogyny hidden in those critiques of animation errors. But you can't always blame external factors. Andromeda is the way it is because of poor management, because of crunch culture, systemic issues that had been building at BioWare for decades. I regret that failure because I love so much of what Mass Effect Andromeda does, and I agree with Mac Walters when he says that a sequel would have fixed so much about the game in the same way that Mass Effect 2 did for Mass Effect 1. But times change, markets change, and the era of big blockbuster sequels every couple of years is long gone. I truly don't know what to expect from Mass Effect 5, but to be honest, my expectations are low. Mostly because I think this marketing strategy of dropping cryptic hints a full decade before the game is actually coming out was a terrible idea that's going to backfire drastically. What I want, a sequel to Andromeda, is not what most people want, and yet it seems like they're committing to making the next game a mix of both, which could work, or could be an absolute train wreck. I truly don't know. All I know is that I'll be there. That's my curse. Even if it's a train wreck, it'll be my train wreck to bear. And, who knows, maybe it will end up helping someone in the same way that these games helped me. To quote Tom Taylorson, over time I've seen a lot of love for the game and its characters, for what it did well, and appreciation from fans for whom it was their game of the moment. A game that helped them, a game that got them through a rough time. There is something to be said for a 7 out of 10 that comes to you in your time of need.
We've done what was needed, and this will always be here for us. But there's a galaxy out there, and you're all pioneers. That's why you're here. We're not done.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. Going through Mass Effect like this has been some of the most challenging writing I've ever done, because these games mean a lot to me, even Andromeda, and they're also very complicated, so I've tried my best, and I hope you've enjoyed that process, and if you did, then a like, comment, share, subscribe would be greatly appreciated. To see my, for now, complete Mass Effect series critique, you can find that in this playlist up here, or for something a bit different, here's a video about an episode of Star Trek Voyager and absolutely nothing else.